Seeing Jesus Through the Eyes of a Child. Audiobook. Written by Kerry Noircourt. Introduction. In the heart of a quiet town, in the foothills of Jamaica, there lived a young girl. Every evening, as the sun dipped low and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, she would sit by the window, her imagination taking her to places far beyond her small world. She often wondered about the stories she heard at Sabbath school and the sermons preached about Jesus at her local church, how he healed the sick, comforted the brokenhearted, and showed love to all. But one evening, as she stared at the vast sky, something new and exciting sparked in her mind. What if Jesus was more than just a healer and teacher? What if, in the quiet moments of his life, he did many other things, just like the people she saw around her every day? What if Jesus had worked as a baker, a teacher, a gardener, or even a builder? Her imagination ran wild, and in that moment she began to picture Jesus in all sorts of roles, each one filled with the same love, kindness, and compassion that he showed in his teachings. As a child, she always dreamt and imagined Jesus with a sense of wonder, purity, and unshakable faith that reflected her unique ability to see him through innocent eyes. To her, Jesus was not a distant or abstract figure, but a loving and approachable friend, one she could talk to, walk with, and trust completely. When she imagined Jesus, she often pictured him as a gentle, kind figure who smiles, laughs, and listens to her heart. In her dreams, Jesus walked beside her in a garden. Jesus had held her hand through many storms. Her imagination allowed her to see Jesus in vivid ways, perhaps surrounded by angels, glowing with a warm, golden light, or joyfully embracing every child who runs to him. This book invites you to journey with Kerry Ann as she explores the many jobs Jesus might have taken on in our world today. Through the eyes of a child, we'll discover how the essence of Jesus' love and service transcends every role, showing that no matter what work we do, we can all make a difference by serving others with compassion, kindness, and grace. Whether as a farmer or a doctor, a carpenter or a friend, Jesus' actions remind us that every job, no matter how big or small, can be an act of love. So, let your imagination run wild too, and join her on a journey of discovering the many ways Jesus might serve in today's world. Her mind drifted further. What if Jesus had been a cook, preparing meals with a heart full of love and care, nourishing the bodies and souls of those around him? Or perhaps he had worked as a teacher, not just in the temple, but in a school, patiently guiding children with wisdom and gentleness. Maybe he had been a builder, crafting homes for families, making sure each corner was filled with warmth, safety, and love. Kerry Ann's imagination stretched far beyond what she had ever considered before, and each new thought sparked a sense of wonder in her heart. As she daydreamed, she realized something incredible. No matter the job, no matter the task, Jesus' presence in each would be the same, full of love, grace, and selflessness. He would make every job meaningful, transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary by showing others the power of serving with a heart full of kindness. Jesus didn't need a title or position to be extraordinary. Every act of service, every task done with love, reflected his teachings. With each thought, she began to understand more deeply how Jesus' love wasn't limited to just his miracles or his famous parables. It extended to every corner of life. His example showed her that any work, no matter how simple, could be a way of serving others and spreading kindness. A small gesture could have the power to heal, to teach, to uplift, and to create a sense of belonging. So, she decided to share her thoughts with others. She began telling her friends, her family, and anyone who would listen about the many jobs Jesus might have done. As she did, she realized that each job she imagined was not only a way for Jesus to serve, but also a reminder for all of them that everyone could make a difference in their world too. Through the lens of Jesus' love, they could bring light and joy to every corner of their lives, no matter what their job might be. This book reflects Carrie Ann's imagination and the lessons she learned. It's an invitation to see Jesus not just as a figure from the past, but as someone whose love transcends time, filling every job, every task, and every relationship with meaning and purpose. So, let your heart be inspired and allow your imagination to soar as you explore the many ways Jesus' love could show up in the work we do every day. You'll discover that no matter what you do, no matter who you are, you too can be a light in the world just as Jesus was and is. Part 1. The Janitor's Touch. The old church on the corner of Main Street wasn't much to look at. Its paint peeled, the windows rattled in the wind, and the bell in the tower hadn't rung in years. But it stood as a gathering place for the weary, a beacon for those in need of hope. And at its heart, quietly moving through the halls, was Jesus, the janitor. Nobody knew much about him. He had simply appeared one day, mop in hand, offering to clean the church for free. Father Harold, the priest, had hesitated at first, but relented when he saw the kindness in the man's eyes. Jesus wasn't like other janitors. He moved with purpose, as if scrubbing floors or wiping windows was a sacred act. But it wasn't just the routine cleaning he focused on, it was the messes that others avoided altogether. The basement storage room, where years of mildew clung to forgotten boxes and the stench of rot seemed permanent, was his first project. Jesus carried out box after box, cleaning each item, discarding the ruined, and organizing the salvageable. By the time he finished, it wasn't just the room that felt lighter, it was Father Harold, who hadn't dared open the door in a decade. "You didn't have to do all that," the priest said, awestruck. "Nobody even goes down there." Jesus smiled as he packed away his tools. "It matters, Father. Just because no one sees it doesn't mean it doesn't weigh on the place. A hidden mess is still a mess, and it only grows heavier with time." It wasn't just physical grime he sought out. Jesus seemed to have an uncanny ability to find the messiest hearts, the lives most tangled with regret and despair. There was Sarah, who came into the church late one night, carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of holding pain in silence. She'd just been evicted from her apartment after losing her job. Her life had unraveled so completely that she didn't even know where to start. She sat on the floor of the sanctuary, hugging her knees, when Jesus approached her with his bucket and mop. "You're not supposed to be here," she said bitterly, her voice trembling. "Neither are you," Jesus replied with a soft smile. "But here we are." She sniffled, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her coat. "What's the point? I'm a disaster. You can't fix that." Jesus knelt beside her, dipping his mop into the bucket. "No disaster is beyond repair," he said. "But you have to start somewhere. Want to help me with the floor?" Sarah hesitated, but took the mop. Together, they worked in silence, and as the bucket filled with dirty water, Sarah began to talk. She spoke of the mistakes she'd made, the people she'd hurt, and the shame she carried. Jesus listened without judgment, nodding occasionally as he scrubbed at a particularly stubborn stain. By the time the floor gleamed, Sarah had a plan. Jesus handed her a clean cloth and said, "Start fresh, one corner at a time." His work wasn't limited to individuals. Jesus had a way of stepping into chaos and bringing peace. One Saturday morning, the church hosted a community yard sale to raise money for repairs. The event quickly descended into disarray, with kids running wild, vendors arguing over table space, and donations piling up in chaotic heaps. Father Harold was on the verge of calling it off when Jesus stepped in. He didn't raise his voice or give orders. Instead, he started sorting the piles, calmly organizing clothes, toys, and books into neat sections. As he worked, others began to follow his lead, drawn by the quiet efficiency of his movements. The children, who had been shrieking and knocking over displays, suddenly found themselves drawn to Jesus, helping him stack boxes and sweep the sidewalk. By the end of the day, the yard sale had not only raised more money than expected, but had also left the community closer than ever. It wasn't just the church building or the people inside it that Jesus touched, it was the whole town. The old park on the edge of town, once a beautiful gathering place, had fallen into neglect over the years. Its swings hung crooked, its benches were covered in graffiti, and trash littered the ground. One morning, residents were surprised to see Jesus there, kneeling in the dirt and planting flowers. At first, people watched him from a distance, unsure of what to make of the strange man cleaning up a forgotten park. But soon, one person joined him, then another, until the entire neighborhood came together. By the end of the week, the park was transformed. The swings were fixed, the benches repainted, and the trash cleared away. In the center of the park, someone placed a small plaque that read, "Even forgotten places deserve love." Jesus sought out the deepest, most entrenched messes, both in the world and in the hearts of those who inhabited it. One night, during a particularly brutal winter storm, the church opened its doors to the homeless. The pews were crowded with people seeking shelter from the cold, many of them carrying years of hardship and despair. Jesus moved among them, handing out blankets, mopping up melted snow, and quietly sitting with those who seemed lost in their own thoughts. A man named Tom, who hadn't spoken a word to anyone in years, finally broke his silence. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Jesus looked at him and said, "Because even the coldest nights need warmth, and even the most broken hearts can be mended." As the weeks turned into months, the stories of Jesus' work spread far beyond the church and into the town itself. People began coming to the church, not just for Sunday services, but for help with problems they didn't know how to face. It became more than just a place of worship. It became a hub of restoration, a lighthouse for the lost. One day, a young man named Matteo showed up at the church doors. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he clutched a brown paper bag. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Matteo had grown up in town, but most people had written him off as a lost cause. Years of addiction had eroded his life until there was nothing left, no friends, no family, no future. Jesus was mopping the floor near the entrance when Matteo stumbled in. The janitor stopped, leaning on the handle of his mop as he looked at the trembling man. "I don't even know why I'm here," Matteo muttered, eyes downcast. I thought maybe—" He trailed off, his voice breaking. Jesus stepped forward and placed a hand on Matteo's shoulder. "Sometimes we come to places like this because we're ready to clean up," he said gently. "But it's not easy work. It'll take time, and it'll get messy before it gets better." Matteo looked at him, his eyes brimming with tears. "I don't think I can do it." "You don't have to do it alone," Jesus said. "Start with one step, just one." Over the next several weeks, Matteo became a regular at the church. Jesus worked with him, one task at a time, scrubbing floors, painting walls, fixing broken furniture. Each task seemed small, but as Matteo worked, his hands grew steadier and his eyes brighter. The other church members, inspired by Jesus, rallied around Matteo, offering him meals, clothes, and words of encouragement. One evening, after finishing a particularly difficult task of repairing a cracked baptismal font, Matteo turned to Jesus and said, "I feel different, like I'm finally clean on the inside." Jesus smiled. "That's because you are. You've done the work. Now keep going." Jesus' influence wasn't confined to individuals. It brought people together in ways no one had thought possible. One stormy night, the town experienced a massive flood. The river overflowed, water rushing into streets and homes, leaving chaos in its wake. When the rain finally stopped, the church opened its doors, and people flocked there for shelter. The sanctuary was packed, families huddled together, strangers sharing what little they had. The floodwaters had left behind a muddy, sopping mess, and tensions were high as people argued over blankets, food, and space. Jesus moved through the crowd with calm determination. He didn't raise his voice or try to force anyone to listen. Instead, he started cleaning. The floodwaters had left behind a muddy, sopping mess, and tensions were high as people argued over blankets, food, and space. Jesus moved through the crowd with calm determination. He didn't raise his voice or try to force anyone to listen. Instead, he started cleaning. He wrung out soaked rugs, mopped up the muddy floors, and even repaired a broken doorframe to keep the cold wind out. People watched him, and slowly, his quiet efforts began to ripple through the crowd. One by one, they picked up mops and brooms, joining him in the work. A group of children who had been crying earlier began helping as well, wiping down pews and carrying supplies. By the end of the night, the church was clean, warm, and filled with the hum of people working together. Father Harold, watching from the corner, marveled at the transformation. "You've done more to bring this town together with a mop and a bucket than I have in years of sermons," he said to Jesus. Jesus simply smiled. Sometimes it's not the words, but the work that shows the way. The most surprising transformation came when the town's wealthiest resident, Mr. Wallace, showed up at the church. Known for his aloofness and obsession with money, Mr. Wallace was the last person anyone expected to see. He walked into the church one afternoon, impeccably dressed, but looking deeply uncomfortable. Jesus was on his hands and knees, scrubbing a particularly stubborn stain from the floor of the confessional booth. "Excuse me," Mr. Wallace said, clearing his throat. I've heard about you. People say you can fix things, clean things up." Jesus looked up, his expression kind but unreadable. "What do you need cleaned?" Wallace hesitated, then took a deep breath. "My life. I've made a lot of money, but I've hurt people along the way. I've ignored the suffering of others, and now I can't sleep at night." Jesus stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "Money can't clean a guilty conscience," he said, "but helping others can. Are you ready to start?" Wallace nodded slowly. Jesus handed him a broom. "Let's start here." The wealthy man spent the next several hours sweeping the church steps, side by side with a homeless man named George. At first, Wallace looked uncomfortable, but as the work progressed, he began to talk with George, learning about his struggles and his dreams. By the time they finished, Wallace was laughing a sound no one had heard from him in years. From that day on, Wallace became one of the church's biggest supporters, using his wealth to fund repairs and programs for those in need. And still, Jesus worked tirelessly and humbly. One day, a little girl named Emma approached him as he was scrubbing graffiti off the church's outer wall. She tugged on his sleeve, holding up a small, dirty teddy bear. "Can you fix him too?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. Jesus knelt down, taking the bear gently in his hands. "Of course," he said, "everything can be made clean." He washed the bear in a basin of soapy water, sewing up its torn seams with precision. When he handed it back to Emma, her face lit up, and she threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she exclaimed, clutching the bear tightly. As she ran off, Father Harold approached Jesus, shaking his head in wonder. "You fix everything, don't you?" Jesus smiled softly. "Not everything. Just what people are willing to let me." And with that, he picked up his mop and continued his work, one small, miraculous act at a time. One morning, as quietly as he had arrived, Jesus was gone. No one saw him leave, but his presence lingered in every corner of the church, in every heart he had touched. The people of the town carried on his work, cleaning, mending, and caring for one another. Above the church door, carved into the wood, were his parting words: "No mess is too great, no life too broken. With love and care, even the darkest places can shine." The Heart Doctor. In the busy halls of Hope Memorial Hospital, Dr. Jesus Nazarene was known for his remarkable skill as a cardiologist. Patients came from far and wide to seek his care, for he not only healed their physical hearts, but also touched their spirits in ways they couldn't explain. His gentle eyes and kind smile brought comfort to everyone he met, and his calm presence turned even the most anxious patient into someone at peace. One day, a middle-aged man named David was rushed into the hospital. He had suffered a heart attack and was in critical condition. Dr. Jesus quickly reviewed his case and performed a life-saving procedure. Over the next few days, David stabilized, but something about his recovery wasn't typical. Despite his physical improvement, his heart remained fragile. His vital signs wavered, and he appeared restless, as though something weighed heavily on him. Dr. Jesus visited David's room one afternoon. Sitting beside his bed, he asked gently, "David, how are you feeling today? And I don't just mean your body, how is your heart?" David hesitated, looking away. "Physically, I'm better," he admitted, "but there's something heavy here." He placed his hand over his chest. "I can't explain it, but it feels like I'm carrying a burden I can't shake." Dr. Jesus nodded knowingly. Sometimes the heart suffers not only from illness, but also from what we carry inside. "Tell me, David, is there something in your life that's causing you pain, something unresolved?" David's eyes welled up with tears. "It's my brother," he said, his voice trembling. "We had a terrible fight years ago over something so foolish now that I think about it. We haven't spoken since. I've held on to the anger, the resentment, and I know he has too, but it's eating me alive." Dr. Jesus placed a comforting hand on David's shoulder. "David, the heart wasn't designed to carry such heavy burdens. Anger, resentment, guilt, they weigh us down and affect not just our spirits, but our bodies as well. Forgiveness is the key to healing, not just for you, but for your brother too." David shook his head. "But how can I forgive him after all these years? And what if he doesn't forgive me?" Dr. Jesus smiled gently. "Forgiveness is not about the other person's response. It's about setting yourself free from the chains of anger and hurt. It's a gift you give yourself. And sometimes, when we take the first step, it opens the door for others to do the same." David thought about this for a long moment. tears streaming down his face. "I don't know if I have the strength," he whispered. "You don't have to do it alone," Dr. Jesus said. "I'll help you carry this burden, just as I've helped so many others. Trust that forgiveness is a path to healing, and your heart will grow stronger for it." That evening, with Dr. Jesus' encouragement, David picked up the phone and called his brother. Their conversation was filled with tears, apologies, and a release of years of pent-up pain. For the first time in a decade, David felt a sense of peace wash over him. The next morning, Dr. Jesus came to check on him. David's vital signs had stabilized, and his face looked brighter, lighter. David paused, his voice faltering, as he struggled to find the right words. "It's like there's a weight on my chest that no medicine can take away. I thought surviving the heart attack would make me feel grateful, but instead, I feel trapped. Something's wrong, doctor." Dr. Jesus leaned forward, his eyes filled with understanding. "David, the heart isn't just a physical organ. Sometimes, the pain we feel in our bodies is connected to what we carry in our hearts emotionally and spiritually. Tell me what's on your mind." Tears welled in David's eyes as he finally spoke. "I've been carrying anger for years, doctor. My brother and I had a falling out over money a decade ago, and we haven't spoken since. I've replayed the arguments in my head 1,000 times, and each time it makes me angrier. Even now, lying here, I can't stop thinking about how he wronged me. I thought I could live with it, but now I wonder if it's been hurting me all along." Dr. Jesus nodded, his voice calm but firm. "David, our hearts were not designed to carry the burden of unforgiveness. Anger, resentment, and bitterness are heavy weights, and over time, they take a toll not just on your emotions, but on your body. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what someone did or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about setting yourself free from the chains that anger and pain have placed on you." David's voice trembled. "But how can I forgive him after everything he's done? How can I let go when he hasn't even apologized?" Dr. Jesus smiled gently. "Forgiveness doesn't depend on the other person's actions. It's a choice you make for your own healing. It's not about what your brother deserves. It's about freeing your own heart. When we forgive, we release the grip that anger has on us. It doesn't mean the hurt didn't happen, but it means it no longer controls us, and in that freedom, your heart can truly heal." David wiped his eyes, silent as he considered Dr. Jesus' words. "I've been so focused on how he hurt me," he said finally, "that I never realized how much it's been hurting me to hold on to it." Dr. Jesus placed a comforting hand on David's shoulder. "Healing your heart is about more than procedures and medicine. It's about letting go of what weighs you down. Forgiveness is one of the most powerful forms of healing, both for your soul and your body, and you don't have to do it alone. I'll be here to help you, but first, you need to take the first step." That night, David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider forgiving his brother, not for his brother's sake, but for his own. He began to pray quietly, asking for the strength to let go of the anger that had consumed him for so long. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen all at once, but something within him began to shift. Over the next few weeks, David's recovery improved dramatically. His heart grew stronger, and so did his spirit. On the day he was discharged, he stopped by Dr. Jesus' office to say goodbye. "Thank you for saving my life," he said. "Not just my physical life, but the life I had lost to bitterness. I called my brother yesterday, and for the first time in 10 years, we talked. There's still a lot to work through, but I feel like I can finally breathe again." Dr. Jesus smiled warmly. "I'm proud of you, David. Forgiveness isn't easy, but it's the greatest gift you can give yourself, and sometimes it's the first step toward reconciliation. Remember, the heart is more than just an organ. It's the core of who you are. Take care of it, not just with medicine, but with love, kindness, and the willingness to let go." As David walked out of the hospital, the world seemed brighter, lighter. For the first time in years, he felt hope in his heart. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that his healing wasn't just about surviving a heart attack. It was about learning to live with a heart free from the chains of the past. The great physician. In the bustling city of New York, in a state-of-the-art hospital nestled between skyscrapers, Dr. Jesus Emmanuel was known as the doctor who could do what others deemed impossible. His patients were drawn not just by his medical expertise, but by the peace that seemed to radiate from him, as if he carried a piece of heaven wherever he went. Dr. Emmanuel was unconventional. He would walk into patient rooms, his stethoscope draped casually over his shoulders, and instead of immediately looking at charts or machines, he would sit down, meet their eyes, and ask, "How are you feeling really feeling?" People found themselves pouring out more than just their symptoms. They spoke of their fears, their regrets, and their broken relationships. And somehow, by the time he left, their burdens felt lighter. One evening, the ER doors burst open, and paramedics wheeled in a young woman named Clara, who had been in a car accident. She was unconscious, her vitals dangerously unstable. The team scrambled around her, shouting orders, but her condition deteriorated quickly. Dr. Emmanuel entered the room, calm amid the chaos. "What's the situation?" he asked, his voice steady. "Massive internal bleeding, multiple fractures. She's slipping away," a nurse replied. Dr. Emmanuel placed his hand gently on Clara's shoulder and closed his eyes for a moment. "You're going to be okay," he whispered. Then, with precision and confidence, he guided the team through the procedures, fixing what seemed unfixable. Hours later, against all odds, Clara stabilized. When she woke up days later, she found Dr. Emmanuel sitting by her bed. She struggled to speak, her voice weak. "They told me I shouldn't have survived. How did you do it?" He smiled gently. "I did my part. But you're here because your life still has a purpose. Sometimes healing isn't just about the body, it's about the soul." Clara began to cry. "I was ready to give up before the accident. My life, it's been a mess." Dr. Emmanuel leaned forward. "It's never too late to start over. Broken things can be made whole again." Word of Dr. Emmanuel's remarkable care spread. People came to him with every kind of ailment, physical, emotional, and even spiritual. He treated a child with a rare disease that had baffled specialists, a homeless man who had given up hope, and a wealthy businessman whose success couldn't cure his loneliness. To each, he gave more than medicine. He offered love, understanding, and a glimpse of something greater. But not everyone understood him. Some of his colleagues criticized his methods. "You spend too much time with patients," one surgeon told him. "This is a hospital, not a therapy session." Dr. Emmanuel simply replied, "Medicine treats the body, but healing touches the whole person. If we don't see the person behind the diagnosis, we're missing the point." One day, a pandemic swept through the city, overwhelming the hospital. Dr. Emmanuel worked tirelessly, moving from patient to patient, offering not just treatments, but comfort. Nurses swore that people seemed to recover faster after he visited them. In the midst of the crisis, a journalist came to interview him, intrigued by the stories of his miraculous work. "Dr. Emmanuel, What drives you to keep going, even when the odds are stacked against you? He paused for a moment before answering. I'm here to remind people they're never alone, no matter how dark it gets. Healing is about hope, and hope changes everything. When the pandemic finally subsided, the city honored Dr. Emmanuel for his extraordinary efforts, but he slipped away quietly, leaving behind a simple note on his office door. Love one another. That's the best medicine. Though no one knew where he went, his legacy remained. Patients, colleagues, and strangers alike carried his words and actions in their hearts. And somewhere, in another corner of the world, Dr. Emmanuel likely continued his work, healing and restoring lives in ways only he could. After Dr. Emmanuel disappeared, the hospital felt his absence profoundly. His former colleagues often found themselves reflecting on his words and actions, realizing how deeply he had transformed the way they approached their work. Dr. Patel, a once rigid cardiologist, began taking time to listen to her patients' fears instead of just prescribing treatments. Nurse Carla, who had grown weary after years in the ER, found a new purpose in comforting the scared and grieving. The hospital staff quietly started calling him the healer, as if the title somehow explained what no one could fully articulate. Meanwhile, stories about him began to emerge from beyond the hospital walls. People spoke of encounters with a man who looked like Dr. Emmanuel, a quiet figure in a worn coat, sitting with the homeless in shelters, visiting prisoners, and helping addicts on the streets. Wherever he went, lives were changed. A recovering addict claimed Dr. Emmanuel had spoken with him on a cold winter night, telling him, "Your chains don't define you. You can walk free." Another woman said he had found her crying in a park and simply held her hand, saying, "You are seen and you are loved." One day, Clara, the young woman whose life Dr. Emmanuel had saved, decided to search for him. Since the accident, she had completely turned her life around, inspired by his words of hope. Now studying to be a doctor herself, she felt compelled to thank him and learn more about the man who had restored her faith in life. Clara visited the hospital and spoke to everyone who had worked with him, but no one knew where he had gone. All they had were memories and stories, each one remarkable in its own way. She tracked down former patients and strangers who had met him, piecing together the puzzle of his life. Each person described the same things: his warmth, his compassion, and the sense that when he spoke to you, he saw every part of you, not just your illness, but your pain, your struggles, and your potential. Eventually, Clara found herself in a small clinic in an impoverished neighborhood. The clinic's director, an elderly woman named Sister Maria, smiled knowingly when Clara asked about Dr. Emmanuel. "He was here for a while," she said. "He helped us treat so many who had no one else. But one day, he moved on. He said there were others who needed him." Clara felt a wave of both disappointment and admiration. "Why does he keep leaving? Why doesn't he stay where people need him?" she asked. Sister Maria chuckled softly. "Child, he doesn't stay because his work is everywhere. He's not meant for one place or one group of people. He goes where the need is greatest, and when he leaves, he trusts that the seeds he's planted will grow." Before Clara left, Sister Maria handed her a small folded piece of paper. "He left this behind for you," she said, as if she had known Clara would come. Clara opened it and read the words scrawled in simple handwriting. "Heal not just with your hands, but with your heart. Love is the cure the world truly needs." Years later, Clara carried those words with her as she became a doctor. She practiced medicine with compassion and faith that reminded everyone of Dr. Emmanuel. She would tell her patients the same words he had once told her. It's never too late to start over. Broken things can be made whole again. And though Dr. Emmanuel was never seen again, his presence remained. He had left behind more than healed bodies. He had sparked a movement of healing hearts, inspiring others to see beyond sickness and into the souls of those they served. His story, much like his message, continued to spread, touching lives in ways that could never be measured, only felt. The Gentle Dentist. In a small suburban town, tucked between a bakery and a bookstore, sat a humble dental clinic with a hand-painted sign that read, Dr. Emmanuel, Gentle Dental Care. The clinic wasn't flashy, nor did it advertise aggressively like the larger practices nearby. Yet patients flocked to it, drawn by stories of a dentist whose work went beyond teeth. Dr. Jesus Emmanuel had a calming presence. Patients often joked that sitting in his chair felt more like therapy than a dental appointment. His office smelled of lavender, soft music played in the background, and the walls were decorated with inspiring quotes about kindness, healing, and hope. One afternoon, a young boy named Max was taken to the clinic by his anxious mother. Max, only 7 years old, had been terrified of dentists since a traumatic experience at another clinic. His face was pale, and he clung to his mother's hand as if letting go would lead him into certain doom. Dr. Emmanuel greeted them with a warm smile, crouching to Max's level. "Hey, buddy," he said gently, "what's your favorite superhero?" Max blinked, surprised by the question. "Spider-Man," he mumbled. "Well, you know Spider-Man has to keep his teeth strong to fight bad guys, right? Let's make sure your superhero smile is ready for action." Max hesitated, but something about Dr. Emmanuel's kind eyes made him nod. As they stepped into the treatment room, Dr. Emmanuel showed Max all the tools, explaining them in fun, non-threatening ways. "This is my magic water sprayer," he said, holding up the air-water syringe, "and this little mirror helps me find hidden treasure in your teeth." By the end of the appointment, Max was laughing, showing off his clean teeth to his mom. "You're a miracle worker," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. Dr. Emmanuel simply smiled and replied, "I just listen and care. That's the real work." However, Dr. Emmanuel's practice extended beyond gentle cleanings and fillings. He often took on patients who couldn't afford care. Homeless individuals, struggling single parents, and frightened immigrants with nowhere else to turn would find themselves welcomed in his clinic. He never asked about insurance or payments up front. "We'll figure it out later," he'd say, and often he'd quietly cover the costs himself. One day, a man named Paul came to the clinic. He had been in excruciating pain for weeks, but had avoided treatment out of fear and shame. Paul had fallen into hard times, losing his job and his home, and his appearance bore the weight of his struggles. When Dr. Emmanuel saw him, he didn't flinch or judge. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Dr. Emmanuel said softly. Paul nodded, tears welling up. "I don't think I deserve this. I can't even pay you." Dr. Emmanuel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Everyone deserves to smile without pain. Let's take care of this together." Paul's treatment took hours, but by the end of it, he was pain-free and smiling for the first time in years. "You don't just fix teeth," Paul said, shaking Dr. Emmanuel's hand. "You heal people." Despite his growing reputation, not everyone appreciated Dr. Emmanuel's approach. Other dentists in town criticized him for undervaluing their profession. "You're ruining the market," one of them told him. If people can't pay, they don't get the service. That's how it works. Dr. Emmanuel simply replied, "Healthy teeth shouldn't be a privilege. It's a need. I'm here to serve, not to profit." As time went on, more people began to notice the impact of his work. Patients often left his clinic feeling lighter, as if he had taken away more than their toothaches. Stories spread of how he had paid for a patient's groceries, helped an elderly woman walk home, or offered kind words that had turned someone's entire day around. One day, a journalist arrived at his clinic to write a feature on him. "Dr. Emmanuel," she asked during the interview, "you've become a local hero. What's your secret?" He smiled thoughtfully. "It's not about being a hero. It's about seeing people as more than their problems. Whether it's a cavity, a broken tooth, or a broken spirit, I try to treat the whole person. Everyone deserves to feel loved and cared for." Before she left, the journalist asked one final question. "If you could tell the world one thing, what would it be?" Dr. Emmanuel paused, then said, with quiet conviction, "A smile is a gift. It shows joy, hope, and connection. But true healing begins when we care for the heart behind the smile. That's where the real work is done." Years later, the people of the town would still tell stories about Dr. Emmanuel, the dentist who turned fear into hope and pain into joy. His clinic became more than a place to fix teeth. It became a sanctuary of healing, a reminder that even in the smallest acts of care, the greatest love can be found. As time went on, Dr. Emmanuel's clinic became a hub not only for dental care, but for hope and transformation. People from all walks of life came through his doors. Some sought relief from pain, while others came simply because they had heard of a dentist who cared not just for teeth, but for the whole person. Dr. Emmanuel's gentle ways and deep compassion seemed to touch everyone who met him, often in ways they didn't expect. One rainy evening, a teenage girl named Mia showed up at the clinic. Her hoodie was pulled tightly over her head, and she avoided eye contact as she mumbled, "I just need a cleaning." But when Dr. Emmanuel examined her, he noticed something unusual. Her teeth were badly worn, her gums inflamed, and her jaw tense, signs of someone who ground their teeth from stress or anxiety. "Are you okay, Mia?" he asked gently, putting down his tools. She shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just fix my teeth." Dr. Emmanuel didn't press her, but instead started talking about his own life as he worked. He shared a story about a time when he had felt overwhelmed and how someone had reminded him that he wasn't alone. As he spoke, Mia's defenses began to crumble. By the time the appointment was over, tears were streaming down her face. I've been having a really hard time," she admitted. "School, my parents, everything. It feels like too much." Dr. Emmanuel handed her a tissue and said softly, "Mia, your pain matters, and you don't have to carry it alone. Just like your teeth, your heart needs care too. Promise me you'll talk to someone about how you're feeling, your parents, a teacher, someone you trust." Mia nodded, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like someone truly saw her. Another time, late on a Friday evening, an elderly woman named Mrs. Collins arrived unannounced, clutching her cheek in pain. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, her voice trembling. "I know it's late, but I didn't know where else to go." Dr. Emmanuel didn't hesitate. "Come in, Mrs. Collins. Let's see what's going on." As he examined her, he realized she had a badly infected tooth that needed to be extracted. The procedure was delicate and time-consuming, but Dr. Emmanuel worked with steady hands and reassuring words. When it was done, Mrs. Collins looked at him with tear-filled eyes. You didn't just take away my pain tonight. You reminded me that kindness still exists in the world. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Emmanuel smiled warmly. Kindness doesn't cost a thing, Mrs. Collins, but it can change everything. As his reputation spread, more people wanted to learn from him. Young dental students would visit his clinic to observe his methods. One of them, a bright but skeptical student named Jordan, questioned his approach. Dr. Emmanuel, you spend so much time with each patient. You could make more money if you worked faster or focused on higher-paying cases. Why do you do it this way? Dr. Emmanuel looked at Jordan and said, Jordan, do you know what a smile means to someone who's lost it? It's not just about teeth. A smile can heal, connect, and restore dignity. If I rushed through my work, I might fix a tooth, but I'd miss the chance to heal a soul. That's why I do it this way. Jordan didn't understand at first, but after weeks of shadowing Dr. Emmanuel, he began to see the difference. It wasn't just about the procedures. It was the way patients left, feeling lighter, freer, and more cared for. Then one day, the unthinkable happened. A powerful storm swept through the town, flooding neighborhoods and destroying businesses. Dr. Emmanuel's clinic was severely damaged, leaving him unable to work. The people of the town, who had been touched by his kindness, banded together to help. Patients, neighbors, and even other dentists donated money, time, and materials to rebuild his clinic. When the doors finally reopened, the hand-painted sign above the door now read, Dr. Emmanuel, a place to smile. During the grand reopening, Dr. Emmanuel stood in front of the crowd that had gathered to celebrate. This clinic isn't just mine, he said. It belongs to all of you because love and kindness are what truly keep it running. I'm so grateful to be a part of this community. From that day forward, Dr. Emmanuel's clinic became more than a dental office. It became a symbol of hope and a reminder that healing is more than fixing what's broken. It's about restoring joy, dignity, and connection in every person who walks through the door. The friendly pharmacist. In the heart of a bustling city, there was a small, unassuming pharmacy called Emmanuel's Remedies. Sandwiched between a laundromat and a diner, it wasn't the flashiest pharmacy in town. Its neon sign flickered occasionally, and its shelves weren't stocked with every brand-name medication. Yet people from all over the city flocked to it, not just for medicine, but for something far more valuable. The owner, Dr. Jesus Emmanuel, wasn't like other pharmacists. He greeted every customer by name, remembered their stories, and often seemed to know what they needed before they even said a word. His pharmacy was more than a place to pick up prescriptions. It was a sanctuary for the weary, the sick, and the lost. One cold morning, a young mother named Rachel came into the pharmacy, her toddler cradled in her arms. The little boy was pale, with a high fever, and Rachel looked frantic. Dr. Emmanuel, she said, her voice shaking, I can't afford the medication he needs. I don't know what to do. Dr. Emmanuel stepped out from behind the counter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Rachel, he said softly, don't worry about the cost. Your son's health is more important than money. He prepared the medicine himself, explaining each step to Rachel so she wouldn't feel overwhelmed. As he handed her the bottle, he added, and remember, Rachel, you're doing a great job as a mother. You're stronger than you realize. Tears filled Rachel's eyes as she nodded. Thank you, she whispered. You don't just give medicine, you give hope. Dr. Emmanuel's reputation spread far and wide. People came to him for advice, even when they didn't have a prescription to fill. One day, a man named David entered the pharmacy, looking nervous. He approached the counter and hesitated before speaking. I don't need any medicine, he stammered, but I've been struggling with anxiety. I feel like it's consuming me. Do you have anything for that? Dr. Emmanuel looked at him with compassion. David, sometimes what we're carrying inside feels too heavy to bear alone. Medicine can help, but have you talked to anyone about how you're feeling? A counselor, perhaps? David shook his head. I'm afraid people will judge me. Dr. Emmanuel smiled gently. There's no shame in asking for help. Let me give you something to ease the symptoms, but promise me you'll speak to someone who can help with the root of it. You're not alone in this. David left the pharmacy not only with a small bottle of medication, but also with a sense of hope and reassurance he hadn't felt in years. Dr. Emmanuel also had a knack for knowing when someone needed more than medicine. One evening, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper came in to refill her heart medication. She was a regular customer, but that day she seemed quieter than usual. Mrs. Harper, Dr. Emmanuel said as he handed her the bottle, is everything all right? She sighed. It's just been lonely since my husband passed. Some days it feels like the world's forgotten me. Dr. Emmanuel stepped around the counter and offered her a chair. You're not forgotten, he said. Your life matters, Mrs. Harper. Why don't you stay for a cup of tea? I'd love to hear more about your husband. As she shared stories of her late husband, Mrs. Harper's face lit up. For the first time in months, she felt seen and valued. Not everyone appreciated Dr. Emmanuel's approach. Some big pharmaceutical companies tried to partner with him, promising larger profits if he promoted their products over cheaper alternatives. But Dr. Emmanuel refused, saying, "My priority is the people, not the profit." When other pharmacists asked why he didn't run his business more efficiently, seeing more customers and cutting back on the time he spent with each person, he replied, "Medicine is more than pills and prescriptions. It's about healing, and healing takes time." One day, a young pharmacist named Claire, fresh out of school, came to shadow Dr. Emmanuel. She was eager to learn, but skeptical of his methods. Dr. Emmanuel, she asked during a quiet moment, why do you spend so much time listening to people's stories? Isn't the goal to get them their medication and move on? Dr. Emmanuel smiled. Claire, medicine can treat the body, but listening heals the soul. Many of the people who come here are carrying burdens far heavier than their illnesses. If I can lighten that load, even just a little, I've done my job. Claire watched him over the next few weeks, seeing how his approach transformed lives. She began to understand that being a pharmacist wasn't just about dispensing drugs, it was about dispensing care, compassion, and hope. Years passed, and Dr. Emmanuel's pharmacy remained a beacon of light in the city. People would often say, "You don't just go to Emmanuel's for medicine, you go there to feel whole again." Years passed, and Dr. Emmanuel's pharmacy remained a beacon of light in the city. People would often say, "You don't just go to Emmanuel's for medicine, you go there to feel whole again." Though he never sought recognition, his impact was undeniable. Patients who had once come to him in despair now lived fuller, healthier lives. His kindness inspired others to care for one another in ways they hadn't before. And though Dr. Emmanuel never sought to explain the profound peace and wisdom he carried, those who encountered him often left wondering if they had just met someone truly extraordinary. For in every pill he dispensed, every comforting word he spoke, and every act of quiet kindness, he left behind a little piece of heaven on earth. As time went on, Emmanuel's Remedies became more than just a pharmacy, it became a lifeline for the entire community. The little shop became a place where people brought not just their prescriptions, but their fears, struggles, and hopes. Dr. Emmanuel always had time for everyone, even when the line stretched out the door. One afternoon, a teenage girl named Lily walked into the pharmacy with a prescription for antidepressants. She handed it to Dr. Emmanuel with trembling hands, avoiding his gaze. "I don't know if these will even help," she muttered. Dr. Emmanuel studied the paper, then looked up at her with a gentle expression. "Lily," he said, "sometimes healing takes more than just one step. These can help your body and mind find balance. But healing your heart takes courage, and you've already shown that by being here today." He filled her prescription, but also gave her something extra, a small booklet he kept on a shelf behind the counter. "This is for you," he said. "It's not medication, but it's filled with words that might bring you some comfort on hard days." The booklet was a collection of short affirmations and prayers. As Lily flipped through the pages, she felt something stir inside her, a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Weeks later, Lily returned to the pharmacy, her face brighter and her posture more confident. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "Those pills helped, but so did your kindness. It made me feel like I wasn't invisible." Dr. Emmanuel smiled warmly. "You were never invisible, Lily. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us we're seen." But one stormy night, a man named Marcus burst into the pharmacy, cradling his wife, who was shaking and pale. "She's diabetic," he said in a panic, "and we ran out of insulin. No one else is open." Without hesitation, Dr. Emmanuel grabbed a vial of insulin and prepped it. He guided Marcus through administering the dose and stayed with them until his wife's condition stabilized. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "You saved her life." Dr. Emmanuel placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You saved her life by bringing her here. Love always moves us to act when it matters most." Not all of Dr. Emmanuel's work was dramatic. Some of it was quiet and unseen, like the nights he stayed late to call patients who hadn't picked up their medications, or the mornings he delivered prescriptions to homebound elderly patients who couldn't make it to the store. One such patient was Mr. Jenkins, a grumpy widower who rarely left his small apartment. Dr. Emmanuel made weekly visits to bring him his heart medication, often staying for a cup of tea, despite Mr. Jenkins's protests. "You don't have to keep coming here, Doc," Mr. Jenkins grumbled one day. "I'm just an old man who's seen better days." Dr. Emmanuel stirred his tea and replied, "Everyone's days are valuable, Mr. Jenkins. No matter how many you've had, you still have more to give to this world." Over time, Mr. Jenkins began to look forward to the visits. He even started venturing out again, inspired by the small but consistent kindness of his unlikely friend. Word of Dr. Emmanuel's unique pharmacy began to spread beyond the city. Journalists wrote articles about him, and charitable organizations offered to fund his work. Yet Dr. Emmanuel refused to let his mission become a spectacle. "This isn't about recognition," he told a reporter one day. "It's about showing people that care and compassion are the best remedies of all. The world needs healing, not just physically, but spiritually. And sometimes, all it takes is one small act of love to spark that healing." One day, a young woman named Elena came to the pharmacy, holding a tattered notebook. She had recently graduated from pharmacy school and had heard about Dr. Emmanuel through the community. "I want to learn from you," she said earnestly. "Not just about medicine, but about how you help people the way you do." Dr. Emmanuel smiled and handed her a broom. "Start by sweeping the floor," he said. Elena looked puzzled, but complied. As she swept, she began to notice things she hadn't at first, how Dr. Emmanuel greeted each person with genuine warmth, how he seemed to know what people needed before they spoke, and how he listened, truly listened, to every story shared with him. By the end of the day, Elena understood. "It's not just about the medicine," she said quietly. Dr. Emmanuel nodded. "Exactly. Medicine can treat symptoms, but love and understanding heal the person. That's the real work we do here." Over the years, Emmanuel's remedies became more than a pharmacy. It became a beacon of hope. People who entered feeling broken, left feeling seen and valued. And though Dr. Emmanuel never sought fame or fortune, his influence spread far and wide. Even after he eventually moved on, the little pharmacy remained, run by those he had mentored, who carried on his legacy of healing through compassion. Above the counter, they kept a simple plaque with words he had once spoken. "Healing is more than medicine, it's love in action." The physical therapist. In a quiet town nestled between rolling hills, there was a small, cozy clinic called Emmanuel Physical Therapy. Unlike the large, sterile clinics that lined the busy streets of the city, Dr. Jesus Emmanuel's clinic had a calming, almost sacred atmosphere. The walls were painted soft colors, with large windows that let in the natural light. There were no loud machines or cold clinical rooms. Instead, the space was filled with soft music and the gentle sound of laughter. Dr. Emmanuel wasn't just any physical therapist, he was known for his deep care and intuitive approach to healing. Patients who came to him weren't just seeking relief from physical pain, they were looking for hope, encouragement, and a sense of connection. One morning, a woman named Sarah arrived at the clinic. She had been suffering from chronic back pain for months, unable to do the things she once loved. Walking was a struggle, and even sitting for long periods caused her discomfort. After seeing multiple specialists who had only prescribed medication, she felt frustrated and defeated. As she walked into Dr. Emmanuel's clinic, she felt a warmth she hadn't expected. Dr. Emmanuel greeted her with a genuine smile, his eyes filled with understanding. "Sarah, I'm glad you're here," he said as he helped her into a treatment room. "Tell me about your pain." As Sarah described her condition, Dr. Emmanuel listened closely, nodding as he took notes. His calm presence made her feel safe, as though she was speaking to someone who truly cared. "I've tried everything," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I just want to be able to pick up my children again, to live without pain." Dr. Emmanuel placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. "You will, Sarah. Healing takes time, but we'll walk through this together." He gently guided her through a series of stretches and strengthening exercises, always adjusting his techniques to her needs. "Healing isn't just about fixing the body," he said, as Sarah began to feel a slight release of tension. "It's about restoring movement, restoring strength, and most importantly, restoring hope." Over the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself coming back to the clinic, not just for the physical relief, but for the encouragement Dr. Emmanuel gave her. It wasn't only her body that was healing, it was her spirit too. He always took the time to ask how she was doing, not just physically, but emotionally. He spoke words of kindness and understanding, reminding her that healing was a journey and that she was not alone. One day, a young man named Thomas arrived at the clinic. He had been in a car accident several months earlier, and although his body had healed physically, he still felt lost. His arm was stiff, and he had trouble moving it freely. But there was more to his pain than just the injury. He felt disconnected, isolated, and unsure of his place in the world. The warden's light. The inmates at Cedar Heights Correctional Facility were used to tough wardens, the kind who barked orders, handed out punishments, and rarely looked them in the eye. So when the new warden arrived, walking through the cold hallways in a long robe beneath his standard uniform jacket, they didn't know what to make of him. His name was Warden Jesus, though some inmates joked and called him Preacher Man. His eyes were kind, but they held something deeper, a sorrow, as if he could see every bad decision they'd ever made and every wound life had given them. Unlike the wardens before him, Jesus didn't just walk the halls with a clipboard. He sat in the yard, talking with men who hadn't had a visitor in years. He listened to their stories, not just their crimes, but their regrets, their fears, their hopes, even the ones they were afraid to say out loud. One day, Big Ronnie, a lifer who ran the yard, asked, "What kind of warden sits with the likes of us?" Jesus smiled. "The kind who sees more than your sentence." The inmates were confused at first. They were used to being reduced to numbers, files, and offenses, but Jesus called them by name, even names they hadn't used since they were kids. And when fights broke out, instead of just locking people in solitary, Jesus stood between them, his calm voice softening clenched fists. "There's a better way," he would say. Slowly, the prison changed. Men who had spent years building walls around their hearts began to open up. They still had to serve their time. Jesus never promised shortcuts, but somehow time felt different under his care. Meals were quieter, grievances were handled with words instead of fists, and some men even began to pray again. Some for the first time since childhood. One night, a young man named Carlos, barely 20, sat in his cell crying. His hands trembled as he held a letter from home, a letter saying his mother had passed. Jesus walked into the cell, with no guards, no threats, just Jesus. "I'm so sorry," Jesus said softly. Carlos looked up. "Why are you even here? You're the warden. You could be in your office." Jesus knelt beside him. "Because no one should grieve alone." The next morning, on the yard wall, someone had scrawled in chalk, "The warden with the scars understands." No one knew who wrote it, but everyone knew it was true. Because Warden Jesus wasn't there to lock them away forever. He was there to show them a key they'd forgotten they had, the key to something even steel bars couldn't contain: hope. Days turned into weeks, and the presence of Warden Jesus shifted from curiosity to comfort. Men who had spent years mastering the art of survival, avoiding eye contact, hiding weakness, found themselves drawn to him, not because he demanded it, but because he offered something they hadn't known in a long time: dignity. Jesus didn't just manage schedules and approve transfers. He swept the cafeteria floor alongside the kitchen crew. He helped paint murals in the chapel, choosing colors even the inmates hadn't imagined for themselves: golds, blues, and gentle greens. When an inmate was released, Jesus was the one who stood at the gate, not with a speech, but with a simple, heartfelt, "Go make something beautiful out there." But not everyone was thrilled. Lieutenant Morris, the longest-serving guard, stood with his arms crossed outside the warden's office. "Warden, I mean no disrespect, but these men are criminals. You treat them like saints." Jesus sat at his desk, hands folded, the faint scar in his palm catching the morning light. "I don't treat them like saints, Morris," he said gently. "I treat them like sons." Morris shook his head. "Some of them ain't worth saving." Jesus stood, walking to the window, watching a group of men lifting weights in the yard. "If you only knew how many people said the same about you," Jesus said softly. Morris froze, a chill running up his spine. No one knew about his troubled past, or so he thought. The riot that never was. One afternoon, tensions boiled over. A new inmate, Tyrell, came in from a rival neighborhood. Old grudges resurfaced like poison, bubbling up through cracks in the floor. By dinner, knives made from melted plastic spoons were passed hand to hand. It was going to be a bloodbath. But before the first punch could be thrown, Jesus walked into the middle of the yard, unarmed, no guards flanking him. Just Jesus. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply removed his coat, showing the robe underneath, and stretched out his arms, hands open, scars visible. "You want to hurt someone?" Jesus' voice echoed through the yard. "Start with me." The men froze. They had seen fear before, from each other, from guards, even from past wardens, but not this. This wasn't fear. This was love so strong it stood between hate and let itself be cut, if it meant saving both sides. One by one, the knives were dropped. Months passed, and something strange happened. Men who had once seen the prison as the end of their stories began to see it as the beginning. They wrote letters home, letters full of apologies and prayers. Some asked for Bibles. Others asked to help in the infirmary, the library, or the garden Jesus helped plant behind the old laundry room. A rumor spread, no one knew how it started, that Warden Jesus had left a key hidden somewhere in the prison, a key that could open any door. Men searched for it, tearing through closets, flipping over mattresses, and even digging in the yard. But they never found it, not a physical key anyway. The truth was, the key wasn't made of metal, it was made of mercy. And every man who forgave himself or asked forgiveness from someone else was holding that key all along. One night, an inmate named Reggie, a man who had spent more years inside than out, asked to speak to Jesus. They sat on a bench in the chapel, the only light coming from a single candle. "I done too much, Warden," Reggie said, his voice trembling. "Too much to ever make it right." Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you want to make it right?" Reggie nodded. "Then start by letting me carry some of that weight," Jesus said. "It was never meant to be yours alone." Reggie wept, right there in front of the man he once called Preacher Man. And Jesus stayed with him until the candle burned out and the sun rose. The warden who left the gate open. Years later, after Jesus had left Cedar Heights, some said transferred, some said retired, his impact remained. The men told stories of the warden who knew their names, who stood between them and their worst selves, who showed them that the prison bars weren't the only walls that needed breaking. And on the gate outside the prison, someone had welded a small plaque, no bigger than a postcard. It read, "This gate once held prisoners. Now it holds stories of grace. The warden with the scars understands." And in every cell, in every heart, the door was left open. If you enjoy our page, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let us know your favorite post. Your support means the world to us. All these books are available on Amazon and the Kindle app.